Hello and a very warm welcome. Lovely to have your company today. I'm Nicola Graham and I'm really excited to be hosting the first in our series of MS Research Update podcasts. Totally auspicious that our first episode should be providing the highlights and the hot topics from ECTRIMs. That's the European Committee for the Treatment and Research of MS. It's the largest annual international congress in the world that's devoted to research in MS. So it's fabulous that we're able to bring this to you. So if you want to know what's happening in the big wide world of MS research, then I encourage you to stay listening. And I'm so lucky today that we have Brett Drummond from MStranslate, and he's going to be providing the insights and the highlights. Brett was up until all hours of the morning because ECTRIMs was in Vienna, listening and collating information to provide us this update. Just a little bit about Brett's background and MStranslate. It's an organisation committed to keeping people living with MS up to date and informed of developments in research and treatments. And Brett and his team provide that information in a really easy to understand way. He's a science communicator. Brett's co-founder of MStranslate, and he's got a passionate background in MS research. Really warm welcome, Brett.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. And as you say, I do appreciate it being just a few days after the conference finished so that I could catch up on a little bit of sleep before we do this chat.
Fantastic. And yeah, I'm hoping that you are a bit over your virtual jet lag now, Brett. So we'll jump straight in. You've just, as we mentioned, participated in ECTRIMs 2021. I'm really keen to hear, what do you think are your top 3 hot topics, and what do you think our listeners would be most excited to hear about?
Yeah, well, there was a lot, and I'll start by saying that I haven't actually managed to narrow it down to 3. I'm going to go with 4. And these are really just the tip of the iceberg as well, because there's so many sessions that go on at the same time at ECTRIMs. I guess to cover the key topics that I think were particularly interesting and would be particularly interesting for people living with MS and the MS community. A session on re-myelination and myelin repair I thought was a particular interest, and something that we know the community is really interested in as being potentially the next big step forward in the treatment of multiple sclerosis. There was also a session on the gut microbiome, which is a really emerging field in multiple sclerosis research, and one that we've talked about a lot on MStranslate. And we know, again, that there is a really large interest from the MS community on that area. Also, there was sessions and topics dotted throughout on symptom management, which is something that I think we've heard the MS community wants a lot more of. It's something certainly from meetings previously that I've had feedback from the MStranslate community that they want to hear more about what they can be doing to manage their symptoms day to day. And I think the research community has listened to that. So we had some talks on that. And obviously particularly relevant at the moment, we had a few talks regarding the response to the COVID-19 vaccines in people living with multiple sclerosis. So that's obviously particularly really important at the moment as we continue to try and deal with the global pandemic.
That's fantastic, Brett. Those 4 topics of your top 3 sound amazing. Can you go through and just give us a little bit of the succinct information on each one? So if we start with the re-myelination, what came out from that in ECTRIMs?
Yeah, so the re-myelination session was interesting. It was largely providing some updates on some recent clinical trials that have been conducted in that area and looking at a few different therapies. There were a couple that did show some potential. Now, there's a very early stage trials, so they're ones that we still need to see a lot more on. There was Abutulast, which showed an ability to reduce brain atrophy, or the loss of brain matter, which we know is something that occurs in people living with multiple sclerosis. There was some work presented out of the University of Cambridge, and the initial trial results were presented at the MS Virtual 2020 conference last year around a treatment called bexarotene. And so while this actually was successful in its trials, it did show potential to repair myelin. The adverse effects and the side effects that the people on the trial experienced as part of this were far too severe for it to be pursued as a therapy. but it's given them a lot of information about what might work and what might not work in this space. And so they are pursuing another couple of therapies in the remyelination area. So metformin, which is actually a diabetes drug that people may know of that's shown some potential in animal models, works similarly to intermittent fasting, which again, they've trialed in those animal models and shown similar results, along with clemistine, which is actually a compound that was found as part of an over-the-counter antihistamine, but it's shown some myelin repair potential in early sort of experiments as well. So they're going to be doing an early clinical trial using a combination of metformin and clemistine at Cambridge, using some of the things that they've learned out of their Vaxarotene trial.
Yeah, it's interesting. Managing your blood sugar levels can potentially help your myelin repair and the intermittent fasting side of things as well.
Yeah, well, there's a lot around that in terms of, I think more and more what we're learning is that the anti-aging process seems to be important for repairing myelin. And so the intermittent fasting is a technique that's known to be really effective in terms of that, and metformin mimicking that in a way. And so that's also part of the learning they got out of the Vaxarotene trial. So it's interesting how all of these things are starting to come together, and the information that we're learning and piecing together is really starting to progress.
And that leads us into a nice segue, really, Brett, onto the gut microbiome.
Yep, almost as if we'd planned it, but we hadn't. So yeah, the gut microbiome is a really interesting area again that I think is something that's quite new. Back when I was more at the research bench, which is going on 10 years ago now, that really I was there, it wasn't something that was talked about hugely in multiple sclerosis at all. And so it's something that's really developed over the past decade. And I think what's interesting is that people are looking at the gut microbiome potentially as a way that can be modified as a novel sort of treatment approach in multiple sclerosis. If we can understand the role that the gut microbiome is playing, then potentially there are easier ways that this can be manipulated. And so some of those ways that were talked about, and it's important to say that these are all at a very early stage and we don't have anywhere near enough data to know whether they would be effective, but things like probiotics and diet are ones that were discussed in that space in terms of, could these be ways of modifying that gut microbiome in a way to make it healthier that helps with managing the multiple sclerosis disease as well. I guess part of the thing at the moment that we don't know is there a good gut microbiome or is there a bad gut microbiome? And so that's something that was discussed as part of the conference. What we do know and what the results that were presented show is that there are certainly differences in the gut microbiome between healthy individuals, or the controls that they use in these studies, and people living with multiple sclerosis. And interestingly, what they've found when they do some of these experiments is that some of the existing multiple sclerosis therapies actually do have some effect on the gut microbiome as well. So an example that was presented as part of the conference was looking at dimethyl fumarate, or Tecfidera, and they found that Akkermansia, sorry to use all of the big names, but Akkermansia is just one of the organisms that's found in the gut microbiome, and it's found that's one of the ones that we know is more prevalent in people living with MS than in healthy controls. And they found that on people who were taking Tecfidera, the levels of that organism were decreased. So it seemed in a way that disease-modifying therapies, and there was another talk that looked at these as well and across different therapies, seemed to be able to potentially normalize the gut microbiome. So it's interesting to think that maybe part of the ways that these therapies are actually having benefits for people living with MS may be through the gut microbiome. And that's certainly not something that originally we might have thought was happening. We know that they have other effects through modifying the immune system, but the link between the gut microbiome and the immune system seems to be becoming more and more clear, especially as how it relates to multiple sclerosis.
Well, the gut and immunity in the gut and our neurotransmitters is becoming a stronger and stronger connection, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Really interesting area. What about we have a lot of inquiries from clients around fecal transplant. When they think about gut microbiome, they think about that as perhaps a literally a magic bullet. Was there anything on that in ECTRIMs?
There was, yes. So there was certainly discussed in one of the talks coming out of some research from New York, or they were sort of covering a research from New York, covering some of the major areas in terms of the gut microbiome. And in terms of the fecal transplants, they sort of looked at two main case studies that have been published on this. I think there's been a lot going on in the area, but potentially not a lot of research that's necessarily been published to this stage. So they focused on these two case studies in terms of people living with MS. And so in one of them, so both were just single individuals. In one of them, they did see that there were some positive changes. So saw that there was a decrease in terms of markers that indicate inflammation. So it seemed to reduce inflammation in this individual, and also increased a protein called BDNF, which we know is a agent that protects neurons. It's neuroprotective. And the individual, in terms of their symptoms, reported having better balance and better mobility after they'd received the transplant. There was also another case study, again, a single individual, of a person living with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And interestingly, and this was just presented as the case study, so there was no actual data that we could look at, but they reported that in this individual, they, after the transplant, were clinically stable for 10 years post-transplant. Now, we don't have any information about what else might have been going on with this individual that might have also led to that, but that's obviously quite interesting. So while those results are obviously really encouraging, I think it's important that we always report clearly in terms of the information that we've gotten. And so there was some comment as well around some potential safety concerns with this transplant that potentially we hadn't really thought of before. It's obviously been, or previously been, thought of as quite a safe treatment. But there has been some recent reports as during this transplant, the recipient received drug-resistant E. coli coming across as part of that transplant. It's been reported in 2 individuals, and actually one of those individuals unfortunately passed away. So I think there's probably a little bit more that we need to know around the safety of this that will develop as well. But yeah, again, another interesting area that's being looked at again as a way of how can we maybe modify the gut microbiome to treat multiple sclerosis.
And I think, again, for our listeners, there are quite a lot of things that people can do to have a healthier gut microbiome as well. And we've certainly got some webinars and podcasts on that. So yeah, a healthy diet, good amounts of fruit and veg, and some great probiotics, yogurt, sauerkraut, etc. And yep. Cutting out sugar. They're all simple things that our listener can do whilst we wait for more sophisticated remedies to come through the research.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And there was actually a presentation in that session as well from a researcher out of the University of California, San Francisco, that's part of a big global group now that are looking into the gut microbiome and multiple sclerosis. And one of their findings was that fruit intake and having large amounts of fruit seemed to be able to normalize the gut microbiome a little bit as well, in terms of bringing it back more to resemble what we see in healthy individuals. So a good message for all of us there that we should perhaps be eating more bananas and apples and oranges. I certainly should be. But yeah, some good information there.
Okay, so Brett, going on then to the symptom management highlights, what did you glean from that?
Yeah, so there was a few different presentations in this area that looked at different symptoms. One of the big sessions, and there was a whole session around it, was looking at cognition and cognitive impairment in people living with multiple sclerosis. I think one of the most sort of interesting and slightly shocking things about that was just how prevalent cognitive impairment is in people living with multiple sclerosis. And in fact, there was some data presented that suggested that in people with clinically isolated syndrome, or CIS, and so this is a sort of precursor to multiple sclerosis, this is the step before people progress to MS. usually around 30% of people, even at that stage, have already got some level of cognitive impairment. And that increases with time across the course of multiple sclerosis. So it's a really big problem in people living with multiple sclerosis, and I'm sure the MS community, I'm sure the listeners of this podcast would agree that it's something that a lot of people do struggle with, and so it's important that we are seeing research in this area. So there was a lot of work being presented in terms of cognitive rehabilitation, especially out of the Kessler Foundation. And so there's certainly some evidence presented there that cognitive rehabilitation seems to be able to provide benefits in terms of decreasing cognitive impairment in people living with multiple sclerosis. They also talked about exercise as having some potential to do that as well, although the consensus as part of that session was, although there is certainly potential and we need to know more about it, the studies that have been published to date on that aren't conclusive, mostly to do with the way that they've been performed rather than the results. So I think that's something that we'll see more of and hopefully presented at the meeting next year to see whether we can get better data in terms of how exercise impacts on cognition. Particularly important because we don't have any pharmacological agents at the moment that help with cognition. So none of our existing therapies benefit cognition in any way.
We definitely have focused on this a bit at MS with our webinars and podcasts as well on brain health. And we know that the earlier we can identify a person who's got MS, and the earlier we can help put in some great lifestyle strategies around brain health, the better the outcomes are. So again, encourage our listeners to have a look at the webinars on brain health and to get started. The sooner the better.
But as well as cognition, there was a small trial presented looking at melatonin and how that can improve sleep in people living with multiple sclerosis. And so this was just, while it was only 30 people, so a relatively small trial at this stage, they did find that treatment with melatonin in this group significantly improved sleep time, sleep efficiency and quality. And the flow-on effect with that was that it decreased fatigue in these individuals. And we know that fatigue is obviously critically important. It's the symptom that is most commonly reported by people living with MS, and also the symptom that they most report impacts on their quality of life.
And sleep, Brett, it's very much tied up with depression as well, isn't it? So if we can improve our sleep, then that helps to protect against depression as well. Anything else on the symptom management side of things?
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up depression, because I think one of the key messages to come out of the conference, if there was a really strong message to come out of the conference, it was actually around smoking. And this is probably a message that we've had a little bit in previous conferences as well, because it's a story that's really developed and we have really strong evidence for it now. And there was more evidence presented out of the UK MS register in terms of this. And essentially the outcome of this was that they found that people living with multiple sclerosis who smoked had worse disease progression and higher rates of depression and anxiety. Importantly, the flip side of that was that they found that quitting smoking at any time was beneficial. So there wasn't a time when these changes are locked in and it's too late to quit. You're already going to have a worse disease outcome, or you're already increased your risk of depression and anxiety to the point where quitting isn't going to make any difference. That certainly wasn't the case. So a very, very key message coming out to all of the neurologists and clinicians that were attending was that they should really be strongly encouraging any of the people that they see to, if they do smoke, to quit smoking, because we know that it is having a really serious impact on a lot of different areas for people living with MS.
And again, for our listeners, we know that's not always an easy ask to quit smoking. And so we have got webinars on quitting smoking. And obviously also there's the quit line, which we encourage people to get help to enable them to quit smoking. And what about the response to COVID-19, Brett? That was your number 4 of your top 3.
number 4, but could potentially have been number 1. Yeah, obviously this is a really important topic at the moment as we continue to navigate global pandemic. And I think the difficulty with this up until now has just been that we don't have or we haven't had enough data to really be able to comment on it. We obviously have a lot of people around the world that are starting to get the vaccines, but people living with multiple sclerosis being just a small subset of that, we need to wait to get the numbers to be able to get anything meaningful out of it. And so mostly what we've seen is some, I guess, two groups, data coming out of Israel and data coming out of Italy were the two main ones that were presented. And these were mostly looking at the response generated to the vaccine in people living with multiple sclerosis on different therapies to see whether or not these therapies impacted on how successful the vaccine was in those individuals. And so in the Israeli study, they looked at people living with multiple sclerosis who weren't currently taking any treatment, who were on cladribine or Mavenclad, who were on fingolimod or Gilenya, and who were on ocrelizumab or Ocrevus. And so what they saw is in these groups, and they were relatively small groups, sort of 40 or 50 people per group, but what they saw was that in people who weren't on any treatment or people who were on cladribine, they generated a really strong response, and the same sort of response that we would see in healthy individuals. When they looked at people on fingolimod and people on ocrelizumab, they saw that response was much lower. And to the point where there obviously were questions around whether or not the response generated would be strong enough to provide protection against.
So Brett, this is post they had the vaccine and they're now testing to see what if there's a B or a T cell response or an immune response, and they're discovering that in this case there was a limited response.
Yep, great question. Yeah, so it's specifically looking at the antibody response or the B cell response in these individuals. So that's sort of our marker to see whether or not the vaccines worked, whether or not these antibodies have been generated against it. And yes, in individuals on fingolimod or in Ocrevus in this cohort, they found that was much less. And that same result was seen in the Italian group as well.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, and you bring up T cells, which is another great point, is that although those responses were lower, certainly in the ocrelizumab group, in the Ocrevus group, they did see that they still managed to generate a T cell response. So that is quite an interesting finding, and we don't yet know how that plays into whether or not people on Ocrevus may be protected from coronavirus, whether the T cell, even though they're not generating that B cell response, is the T cell response that they're getting enough to provide that protection. So I think it's something that's just giving us more information and things to be looking out for. I guess the main takeaway from that is that people on fingolimod or people on ocrelizumab probably want to be monitoring their response post-vaccine to see whether or not they have managed to generate those antibodies. And I think that's something that will start to happen more. That was certainly the recommendation out of the conference. There's also something talked about in terms of the timing from the last treatment is going to be important. And so potentially, waiting longer after the last treatment of ocrelizumab, for example, may be more effective at generating that sort of response. There was some work out of the Italian study that suggested that the mRNA vaccines were more effective at getting a response in these people, and Moderna seemed to be better than Pfizer. So potentially there was some difference in terms of the type of vaccine, but that's all still very early as well. I don't think we're at the point yet where we can decide on that. And the key message coming out of all of the people that presented in the session was still that people living with MS should be getting a vaccine, and they should be getting the vaccine that is available to them. Obviously, the last point around this, and something that we've seen fantastically already mentioned here in Australia and is true around the world as well, is that people who are immunosuppressed or on some immunosuppressive medications will be eligible to get a third dose of the vaccine, so to get this booster. And we've seen in other studies that may be effective in those ones who aren't generating a very strong response after the first two, can actually boost that response quite a bit. So again, that's something we don't have data yet in terms of seeing that in people living with MS, but that's something that we'll see more and more of as we continue to go through this.
That's great to get that up-to-date information, Brett. Thank you.
Sorry, just to jump in quickly, the one thing I would say around that as well is that the best place for people to be going for information on all of that is MS organisation. So I know MS Australia has a page up with their guidelines for COVID vaccines, and MS organisations around the world are continuing to update those with best practice that's being given by neurologists. So certainly those sites are worth visiting to make sure you get the latest in your local area.
Fantastic, Brett. Thank you. And I just wanted to ask you, what surprised you most at ECTRIMs this year?
I can't say that I stayed awake, can I? That wouldn't be. Yes. That I managed to do through until 4 a.m. 3 nights in a row. No.
What kept you up? Was it a strong supply of coffee all the way through, Brett, and then you couldn't sleep after that?
Yeah, there were certainly a few coffees consumed throughout. But interestingly, I didn't find it very difficult to stay awake, and I think that's a testament to the quality of the information that was being presented. If it tended to be a less interesting information, then probably would have felt a little bit sleepier, but actually didn't get tired at all through the conference. So that was a good sign. But in terms of the things that surprised me, I think there were two main things. The first one was just the wide range of topics that were presented. I think if we go back a few years, we would largely have seen these meetings where there was just a really strong focus on treatments. Both new and emerging treatments, but existing treatments and how effective they are and things that we can learn around that. Whereas at this meeting, I think we were seeing that there were topics being presented across all different scopes of the journey for people living with multiple sclerosis. So there was still information presented at a really basic science level, looking into what might be causing multiple sclerosis, what's happening with the immune system. There was still the information about treatments, both new treatments coming out of trials and the effectiveness of current treatments. But then going through to, as I've already mentioned, symptom management and lifestyle modifications. And I think that especially those last two is a result of the power of the voice of the multiple sclerosis community. The things that I think people living with MS have pushed to see more work done on for many years. And I think it's really great to see that funding bodies and researchers have listened to that, and that's why we're seeing more presentations done on those areas.
Well, it is an area that our listeners can exert a little bit of control over themselves whilst they wait for some other breakthroughs in research, so I can appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, one of the conversations that I actually had largely on Twitter during the conference was around, especially if we stay in this virtual space a little bit, there is a real potential to involve people living with MS and the MS community in these research conferences. I was quite heavily pushing to have an extra day of a conference where it is all centered around having research presented directly to the MS community and engaging them in two-way discussions with researchers, because researchers have a lot to learn from people living with MS, and people living with MS obviously are interested in the information. So I think sort of bringing those groups together could be a really powerful way of moving forward in this area. And I completely agree with you that the power that the community has to speak up and say what they're interested in and what they want to see more research into is a really great way that they can be engaged and participate in research.
Brett, I really hope that request from you is heard and met with compassion and understanding, because I think that would be fantastic if we could have a day that is pitched with the researchers to people with MS. It would be a two-way benefit for sure. I'm really interested, Brett, to know, just as we wrap up, last question, what area of research are you going to be watching most closely?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the ones that I've already mentioned. Over the short term, I think we'll have to be watching the research into the COVID-19 vaccines, just because it is so critical for people living with multiple sclerosis at the moment. So that's certainly one. I think the other one will be re-myelination. I think for me, that's an area where we're starting to see a lot of work go into. I do think that is a really big step forward in terms of the next thing that may be able to benefit people living with multiple sclerosis to manage the disease. I think that the current treatments that we have are really effective in terms of being able to dampen down the immune response, especially when we add in something like HSCT, which we haven't talked about yet, although I have seen that MS Australia have just published an article on that, so I recommend people go and read their update on that topic. But that I think, going beyond that and actually being able to repair the damage that occurs rather than just necessarily stopping new damage or slowing new damage, if we can repair damage, that gives us the potential to, maybe be able to actually reverse some symptoms. And that would be fantastic. So I think that's the area that I'll be following most closely. The trials coming out of Cambridge, certainly I'll be looking into closely. I think that's probably for me the big one.
Well, we'll have to keep our ears to the ground with that re-myelination especially. Brett, you mentioned HSCT, so I would like to just squeeze that into our podcast as well. Can you give us a quick overview of what came out of ECTRIMs on that topic of stem cell?
Yeah, so there was a lot of work done on this, and I think it's a really big area at the moment in terms of multiple sclerosis research. We're seeing more and more trials conducted on this, and there was a lot actually over the past couple of years as well in terms of this treatment and how it could be used for people living with multiple sclerosis. There was, what I've heard, was a fantastic talk at ECTRIMs around a trial looking at HSCT in people living with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. Now, I actually haven't managed to watch that presentation yet, but I will be providing updates after I've had a chance to go back and watch that. But I think more and more we're seeing now that there is a growing understanding in the MS research community that HSCT can be a really effective therapy for some people living with multiple sclerosis, and that's what the data is showing. We now have a lot of data in this area to suggest that, especially in the right people, and trying to find who are the right people to benefit from this treatment, because it is, it's not a small treatment. It's obviously quite an invasive procedure. It's difficult to go through. But understanding who are the best place to benefit from it is something that we've seen. And the general consensus on that is that people probably early in their disease course who have quite aggressive disease, so really highly inflammatory disease, who have failed another therapy, are probably the best place to benefit from it. Now, that's not to say that other people can't benefit from it. That's just what the research has shown at the moment are the people who are most likely to derive benefits. And we've seen that some of the benefits from it can be really long-term. I mean, we have studies now where they've looked out to 8 to 10 years of people who have got really long-term control of their disease through having that treatment. We'll look to see what the presentation was on secondary progressive MS at ECTRIMs. I'm really interested to see what that is, because I think obviously progressive MS is an area that we haven't talked a lot about yet on the podcast, and we could end up doing a podcast for 2.5 hours, but I know we don't want it to go that long. But if there are some new treatment approaches that can be found that can benefit people living with progressive MS, then that's obviously hugely important, because there is still, not a lot of therapies that are approved for use in that group of people. So very interested to watch that when I get a chance.
Fantastic. Brett, thank you so much. Thanks for staying up all night and into the early hours of the morning so that our listeners can benefit from your experience. And thanks for all the time you spent covering ECTRIMs and putting forward the information in a really beautiful, easy to understand fashion. If people want more information on a particular topic, so for example, the stem cell area that you would like to have a bit more of a look at, where can they head to, Brett, for a bit more info from ECTRIMs?
Yeah, so certainly I'd be recommending obviously following MStranslate. If I can say MStranslate as a site, will be continuing to post updates on ECTRIMs as I continue to look through the presentations, and I'll be doing a few more video conversations with a researcher from the US, Dr. Travis Stiles, who's recently joined the team and actually works in the re-myelination space. So we'll certainly be talking about that topic a lot more with him. But aside from MStranslate, I would say obviously MS Australia, as I said, have posted some great articles lately. Stay tuned to MS Limited as well, or MS Get Involved as they are on Facebook. because obviously you're doing these podcasts and we'll have a lot of information as well. And really just, I guess, looking online, but being careful about where you look. And if you find information online that you want to know more about or have questions, certainly I'm happy to answer questions. You can contact me through any of the MStranslate social media platforms, or you can contact your MS organizations as well. While there is a lot of great information online, we also know that there is a lot of misinformation online. So certainly access the great resources that are around to be able to help you with any of those questions if you do have them.
That's fantastic, Brett. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you. And thanks for joining us today. Remember, you can access our services, whether it's NDIS or nurse advisors, social workers, employment support, education, etc., through calling MS Connect on 1-800-042-138. And as Brett said, if you want more information about any of the topics we've touched on today, you can call our MS Connect number, 1-800-042-138, or you can look on our website as well. If you found the podcast useful, we'd love you to subscribe to the series. We've got further MS research podcasts coming out. We'd love to hear your ideas for topics and guests. Please get in touch, email us. We'd love to hear from you. education@ms.org.au. Thanks for your company today, and bye for now.